All right. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good maybe middle of the night, depending on when you're calling in and maybe listening to this later, because as you just heard, it's being recorded. So thank you everyone for coming, and we welcome you to the final part of a three-part interactive seminar series that we've had focused on effective conservation social science communication. I am Dr. Shannon Westlake. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am virtually coming to you all today from Lexington, Kentucky in the United States. So it's a good evening coming from me today. I'm a regional social scientist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I have been a member of the Society for Conservation Biology's Social Science Working Group, it's a mouthful, you can call it SSWG for short, for several years. A few years ago, after joining the Student Affairs Committee of SSWG, we started talking about the need for developing a communication webinar series such as this. I'm very grateful to be sharing this time with you all today, talking about this very important topic. Conservation cannot be most effectively accomplished by one person or by one group of people, which is why collaborative transdisciplinary efforts are essential. Such efforts may include bringing together academics and practitioners from different disciplines and people from different societal groups, such as government, civil society, practitioners, and industry, to generate knowledge to address real-world problems. Yet collaboration is challenging because different types of professionals, such as natural scientists, social scientists, and others, all have their own knowledge, experiences, and language that can sometimes complicate conversations, such as the same word meaning vastly different things across disciplines. There have been recent calls for transdisciplinary research, which have highlighted the promise of working across disciplines, yet efforts to engage in such research are early, requiring significant time and resources. In this webinar, we seek to examine the resources, tools, and techniques that have proved useful for effective science communication with policymakers by asking some experts in this field to share their experience. This webinar series is being hosted by the Society for Conservation Biology's Social Science Working Group. I would like to now pass it briefly to Dr. Matthew Solinsky, the SSWG president, for a few words about this group.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks everyone for joining us. Before we begin, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. And for those that don't know, acknowledgement of country is a demonstration of respect for the traditional custodians on the lands of which a meeting is being held. And since we're holding this kind of in collaboration with SCBO, the Oceania section of SCB, I'd like to start off by saying I acknowledge the people of the Wairong and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands I conduct my research, teaching, and service. I respectfully acknowledge ancestors, elders, and past and present, and who have always been caring for country. We pay our respects to country, the life world that sustains us all. I also acknowledge any traditional owners in the audience today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which each of you are living, learning, and working. As Shannon said, I'm the president of the Social Science Working Group of Society of Conservation Biology, and our mission within SSWG is to strengthen the social sciences and their application to conservation. There's a lot of great ways to get involved, but as you can see, and I'm going to get into those in just a second, we're a global membership from over 60 countries. We're the largest working group within within SCB, and we've got nearly 600 SCB members, both students and professionals. We also have an excellent listserv. If you haven't signed up before, please do. There's over 1,700 individuals on that listserv that we share resources, job announcements, ask questions. It's a really great community of practice online. I'm going to pop in some ways to get involved in SCB here in just a second here. So we're on LinkedIn. Get involved with us on Twitter as well, and sign up if you're interested in volunteering on the Student Affairs Committee, which put on this webinar and the series of webinars. Please get involved and volunteer. We also have a mentoring call going out right now. So we're have an intake of both mentors and mentees for the 2023 year. So if you or someone you know would like to be involved in that program, please do visit our website, and the link is in the chat. I'm excited for this last seminar. This was, again, done in collaboration with SCBO, the Oceania section. And I'd really like to thank Shannon for her leadership on leading this series. So congratulations to her on a job well done. And so without further ado, Shannon, back to you.
Thank you, Matthew. The job well done because it's surrounded by amazing people. It makes my job a lot easier. So thank you all. All right, so some rules of engagement for today. So although we would much prefer having this engaging discussion in person, we hope that you still will find value in this virtual platform, or even after the fact if you're watching the recording right now. Because we would hope for this to be a bit interactive, we would like to share some rules of engagement. First, please be kind. We are all human beings navigating the challenging world before us, which means we will undoubtedly say the wrong thing, infuse our words with emotions, or have different perspectives than others at times. Please help us recognize and respect that we are all here to learn and grow in our own time and at our own pace. Second, please be inclusive. We are grateful to be spanning multiple time zones and geographies with this webinar, and we want to make sure all feel welcome and are included to show up as they are without judgment. Third, please be constructive, not critical. As we all know, there is no one-size-fits-all message approach that will work in all situations. Today, we have pulled together some excellent presenters who will share what has worked for them, but it is okay if it has not or will not work for you. If you have your own suggestions on approaches and best practices, we encourage you to share them in the Padlet that I will include in the chat in a few moments. Finally, again, to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on SSWG's website. So in designing this webinar structure, we wanted to do more than the straightforward 1-hour webinar where presenters speak and attendees listen. Although webinars like this are usually a treasure trove of information, they can also sometimes fade to the background when we have a million things competing for our attention. I like to refer to this as sign up, show up, and check out behavior. And I have been just as guilty of this in the past. The challenge is, how do you make a webinar like this interactive and valuable when you expect more than 100 people in attendance? Our approach is to use 2 interaction elements, Padlet and Menti polls. We would like to encourage all of you to use the Padlet throughout the session, and we are intending to save time at the end of this webinar for reflections and discussions on some things that were said by our presenters and shared by our attendees through the chat and in the Padlet. I will now review a few simple instructions for its use. And I'm going to also drop into the chat the link so you can all join me on this page. Sorry, I have to type it. I should have had it copied and ready to go. All right, that should work. So in this Padlet, you will see some categories to which you can post your comments, questions, and recommendations. You can also add to and like fellow participants' posts if you would like. Your feedback on this Padlet is valuable because one of our intended deliverables from this webinar series is a best practices document that will be informed by presenters' recommendations and the feedback we receive from you all. On this slide, you can see some simple instructions for how to use the Padlet if you have never done so before. And if you have any issues with it or need further assistance during this webinar, feel free to drop a question in the chat. The other thing that we would like to do before getting going is have you all join us here on Menti using this code that you see on the screen, 538677. We would like to first learn where you all are coming from today. We know that there's going to be a strong Oceania presence for this webinar, but it's always fun to see where people are calling in from. So if you can and would like to, please go to that link that you see there and type in that code. Oops, sorry. Once you're there, you'll be able to answer the questions, and I'm going to pop over to that screen now, so bear with me with my technology sharing.
Strong Melbourne presence.
As expected. Always fun to see it populate and change.
Shen, what's that code? Okay.
Oh, do you have it? All right. I will stop sharing that one for right now. And bear with me again. There is another question that we have in there that we are hoping you all will answer. And it should open up for you now, hopefully. Doesn't always work. Do you all see a second question? Not yet? See, so it always happens. Let's see.
It's good now.
Good now? Okay. Got a lot of learners in the room. I'm right there with you. All right, that's slowing down. So I will stop sharing that for now and go back to our presentation. But if you haven't answered yet, feel free to do so. All right. Thank you for bearing with me through all my screen sharing. So today, the main event, let's get to it. So today we will first hear from 3 amazing presenters about best practices for effectively communicating science with policymakers, including assessing who is our audience and who are we in the conversation and the importance of listening from Professor Richie Howard, learning from our audience, such as their needs, preferences, and processes, and how to approach this with a strategic framework from Director Fern Hames, and then some specific grounded examples of forest and fire management and the important process piece of translation, which happens in practice from Professor Catherine Williams. Oops, my apologies again. Throughout their presentations, we encourage you to drop your thoughts into the Padlet. At the conclusion of the presentations, we will move into a moderated discussion where we will answer some of the questions that were put forth and reflect on some of the postings that we saw in the Padlet. So as you saw, our first presentation today is from Professor Richie Howard, who uses pronouns he, him. While he gets his presentation ready to share, I will give a brief introduction. Richie was professor of human geography at Macquarie University. I apologize if I mispronounced that. He retired in 2018 and continues to ponder how to address the trauma and destruction wrought by colonization across scales, from the interpersonal to the intercultural. His interest in the policy, practice, experience, understanding nexus between institutions, populations, and places derives both from his university experience in community outreach and governance roles, and from extensive fieldwork in the social impacts of major resource and infrastructure projects in Indigenous places across Australia. He has provided policy advice to many Indigenous groups and also to local, state, and national governments, as well as continuing to work in mentoring and governance roles in retirement. We are very grateful that you are working in your retirement now for us today to share some of these things. So I will pass it over to you now, Richie.
Thanks very much, Fern. Hopefully I'm sharing my screen okay.
Yep, it's coming up.
Okay, thank you. And I think I've got 10 minutes, is that right?
Yeah, 10 to 12 minutes roughly.
Okay, I'll do my best. Thanks everybody for joining us. Warami Miraga, I'm coming to you from Wallamadigal country in the Darug Nation in Sydney on the east coast of Australia. And I want to talk about knowing our audiences and knowing ourselves as communicators. So I guess if I've got a philosophical label, I'm a radical contextualist, which means I think that context really matters. So I want to start by acknowledging country, but not just country, it's country and the places, the people that make country, the histories and geographies that are the context in which we work. So first of all, I want to ask, who is it that is the knower in the situations that we're working in? Who speaks, who listens, and who responds? I think that some of the communication problems that we have in many of the situations we work in, and I'll hopefully not get too derailed by yarning too much, but I'll try and keep on track. But part of the problem is that we actually don't know who knows, or we assume who knows and who's got a right to speak. And often knowing the audience and the foundation from which we speak ourselves and what makes us worth hearing and what makes others worth hearing, that notion of audience and reception is absolutely foundational to good communication. One of the barriers to good communication, I think, in my experience, is self-importance. And speaking as an academic, we're in an industry which is full of self-important people. It's interesting to watch how so many scientists are so convinced of how important it is that others listen to them without actually ever thinking how important it is to listen to others. And we are often convinced that our evidence is somehow context-free, that we get so eager to communicate that we forget that communication's a one-way thing. We forget to listen to what our audiences, whether they're our intended audiences or our accidental audiences, incidental audiences, and other interested parties who we don't even think of as part of our audience. What do they already know? What do they think they know? And what do they believe they know? And what do they need to know or think they need to know? I'm often, aghast at science students who start their presentations with what they believe rather than what they understand, or dismiss other parts of their audiences on the basis of that's a belief rather than an understanding. So I think opening ourselves to listening is incredibly important, because communication is never a one-way thing. The work that we do almost always has multiple audiences that we need to communicate with. And to communicate, we often need to build relationships. And as practitioners, it's those relationships, I think, that become exceptionally important at times. We sometimes, I think, as scientists and social scientists, think that the most critical audience for our work is our scientific peers, the reviewers of our journal articles, the reviewers for funding agencies, or the key stakeholders for a particular report. But in my experience, one of the things that we easily forget is that our highest impact work, the work that actually makes the most change, often communicates in unexpected ways, or it will communicate with unexpected, unanticipated audiences. And what's interesting when we think about that is it often builds on the threads of our own identities, the stories, the narratives that we tell the way that our expertise has been built and the way that it's perceived. So that communication builds on our existing relationships. So we often think that we don't have the right relationships with the right audiences. After all, the policymakers sit in parliaments or in public service offices. We think the decision makers sit in the boardrooms and executive offices. And so we think they're the ones that we need to reach. They're who make the policies, who make the decisions. But in my experience, and my experience draws on work in resource development, infrastructure development, tourism, more broadly across environmental management. In my experience, people often look to influence a single decision. They target a specific decision point, a stop-go, a yes-no decision, a particular environmental approval or project progress approval decision. And in the process, they target key audiences that seem to be structural, and because they use organisational titles and positions as the guide for who they need to influence. So I want to take a step into the Indigenous domains, which is where most of my work has been done. And I think that in those domains, but much more widely than we often imagine, there are protocols, values, relationality that underpins how things actually work and how things actually get decided. So underpinning who makes the policies and who makes the decisions. Corporate, government and community protocols, priorities, values, and the institutions and structures in which they evolve all influence how science communication, scientific evidence, scientific insight is perceived, is understood, and is responded to. In the Indigenous domain, those protocols are often typed as cultural protocols are particularly poorly understood by outsiders. They're often breached. They're often, when people are silent because they're not talking on their own country in the Australian context, that's often interpreted not as an observation of protocol, but as a level of ignorance or unwillingness to communicate. And communication, of course, builds on trust that reflects relationships as much as it reflects the credibility of the evidence that we marshal. And relationality has become a buzzword relatively recently. But building relationships with our audiences has always been important. And I use the active present future tense grammar there of building relationships rather than just having a relationship or being in a relationship. And critical to that process of building relationships is listening. That listening is an ongoing thing. It's not just listening to accumulate evidence so that one can speak. And I always find it ironic with an audience like this, that as an old bloke, I'm asked to speak rather than to listen. And one of the things that we need to remember is not just that listening is complicated, but learning to listen is usually a really convoluted, slow, and complicated process. And often a source of a lot of embarrassment when you realise you've heard things wrongly or misunderstood what was being said. I remember a student of mine working in the Western deserts of Western Australia who said she'd been told something almost in the first week of her fieldwork. And 10 years later, she finally understood what she'd been told very early in her fieldwork. So we shouldn't assume that hearing is the same as listening. And that listening, that deep listening, is an incredibly important part of communication. And I think that perhaps the big lesson from that is that there is no such thing as a stupid question. And I always remember, after I've said that to students and colleagues, well, there are stupid questions. They're the ones you don't ask. Or more importantly, in our roles as experts, they're the ones you don't answer. Because we always need to be ready and willing to answer questions that might seem out of place. Because if you address those questions, people know you're listening, you're building a listening relationship. I can remember being in negotiations about the terms of reference for a major social impact study, where after a day and a half of negotiation, one of my anthropology colleagues in the organisation that was commissioning the research said, I've been here for a day and a half and I still don't know why you're here as a geographer. And all of my colleagues around the table took a deep breath thinking I'd blow my top. And I thought, well, that's a reasonable question. If you don't know, I'll have a go at explaining why I'm here. And that person ended up being an incredibly valuable collaborator in that process because she began to understand what I had to offer and why I was in the room and why I was in the field in the end. So hearing the question that's asked and answering it, rather than saying what you think needs to be said, oh, you should know who I am and what I'm doing here, that little bit of humility to be able to say, yeah, if you've got a question, I should be able to answer it. That's critical in building trust and building shared understanding. And of course, the other lesson as an expert is if you don't know, don't fudge. And if for those of us who are teachers, you've got to understand that not knowing offers us an opportunity to learn. So we often have this feeling in discussions of wanting to say, ask me, I know the right answer. And as I said earlier, the cultural protocols around recognizing the diversity, the difference in which we work, and almost every setting we can imagine working in is intercultural in some way or another. That recognizing there are protocols, recognizing that we are working in value-laden settings will allow us to really think about how we build trust, how we ultimately contribute to better decisions. So we need to think about, when we're involved in communication, what's important. So many of the decision makers that we try to influence value what's measured rather than seeking to measure what's valued. And part of our role as experts, part of the learning that we must bring as social scientists, I think, is that we have to communicate what's important, not just what's measured. We need to recognize that decisions are often relying on value judgments rather than numbers, and that key decisions come down to value judgments. So the best communicators in our business articulate the values that matter rather than assume that whatever's been measured, whatever data has been measured and captured, that captures what needs to be valued. And we need to communicate in ways that support and catalyze transition to more just, equitable and sustainable futures. Hijirigora, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for listening. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Richie. I was still listening. I wasn't ready to talk yet. It was awesome. I love listening to you, and I've really enjoyed working with you over the past few months to get ready for this. I love when people make me write stuff down. When I hear something, I'm like, I need to write that down and save it. And you are good at that. Two things that I just wrote down there that I love are, we shouldn't assume that hearing is part of listening. I think it's so easy when we're talking with someone to start formulating what we want to say before they're even done saying, speaking, which means we're not active listening. And that's a really, really important thing for relationship building, to not automatically turn the story and make it about me, but like keep it on you. You ask the question, let me answer what you need. And then your other comment there at the end, many decision makers value what is measured rather than seek to measure what is valued. I feel like I'm going to write that down as a poster and just have it above my desk to always look at, because it's so important for us to be measuring what is valued. So thank you so much for that. And we will have time for questions at the end, so no worries about that. I'm going to do a quick screen share again. Bear with me. All right. Next up, our second presentation today is from Director Fern Hames, who uses the pronouns she, her. Fern is the director of the Arthur Ryla Institute. Hopefully I pronounced that right. I probably should have checked all my pronunciations before starting. So the Arthur Ryla Institute for Environmental Research, or ARI for short, in Victoria, Australia. She leads a team of researchers exploring ecology, environment, human behavior change, and multiple ways of knowing place. ARI describes their work as science that matters, with more than 100 researchers working to make a difference for nature. ARI's connections with decision makers are crucial. For their work to make a difference, it has to be linked into decision-making processes and networks. Fern is passionate about wild places, stories, and about connecting people with nature and knowledges. Her work has extended into volunteering on citizen science efforts in remote parts of Australia, on lakes in Myanmar and Tanzania, and on leadership in Antarctica. She is committed to making a difference and nourishing values-based leadership. I will now stop sharing and pass it over to you, Fern. And you're still muted, just in case.
Okay, how is that? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
It should be changing to there. There. I think we're
Perfect.
finally organized. Hooray. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Richie, for that. That was just such a fabulous start. And thank you to everybody for coming along today. Fabulous to see a lot of familiar and unfamiliar names in the audience. This is really terrific. So thank you. I'm going to talk with you about the science to policy with a whole range of different pathways, people and practices that our experience of things that we've found to work in our particular context. As Richie said, context is everything. So be taking note of that. So before I start, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country that I'm joining you from today, and all the different lands that we have people variously joining in from today. I pay my respects to traditional owners, elders past and present, and all First Nations people who might be joining us today as well. And I acknowledge the long-standing many generations of science that help us understand that we're currently still in bitter up season, I think, with flying butterflies, grasses flowering, and the Southern Cross high in the south at sunrise. I think we're about to head into eel season. We're in that shifting sort of moment, but this is some of the knowledge that traditional owners are passing down to us. So Shannon mentioned a little bit of a capture of what ARI is, but I thought I would just set the scene and give you a sense of context of why science to policy is important for us. ARI is an applied research institute. We're an institute for environmental research, and we sit within a state government organisation in Australia. That state government department is the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action. So it's a large one of several thousand people, and we provide science into decision-making in that department. Our vision is that our science underpins high-quality, evidence-based decision-making by governments and communities. So this is completely of interest and relevance to us. This is exactly what we're interested in. And we do, as Shannon mentioned, we've got about 100 staff, ecologists, plus a bunch of social science people as well, interested in ecology in different realms across the landscape and in human behaviour change and in different ways of knowing. And we work with a whole range of different partners, if you like, lots of people across our own department, but also a whole lot of other government organisations, universities, natural resource management practitioners, and a few international organisations as well. So lots of different partners that we are hoping to influence and having those relationships around what might change. I just wanted to pause for a moment and reflect on why this matters at the different layers in which I tend to think about why anything matters. And I usually think about these things in this layered approach of me, we, world. So in terms of the me layer, I'm thinking about that for our staff as individuals. Why are we interested in influencing policy or decision making? Well, if you ask pretty much all of the 100 staff at ARI, why are they here? And what's one of their key values? It is making a difference. People here want to make a difference in the world in things that matter in the context of the environment, conservation, and how humans are part of our environment. So it's a key driver for individuals in our organisation. If we think of it at the organisational level, the we level, for our government or the various agencies that we're working with, they want to be able to make the best decisions. They want evidence-led decisions. They want to use their resources to make the best investment decisions that they can. They want to be doing the best actions that they can that are likely to have the right kind of results that they need to make. And at a society level, having science-informed decision-making gives them community confidence that those decisions are based on evidence and rigour and some really thoughtful thinking. At the sort of world level, in terms of the environment, we want decision-making to be based on science so that we get the outcomes that are most effective in the world. So there's lots of reasons why it's important to have this influence and impact. Now, ARI, as I said, we are a research organisation. We're an applied research organisation. And a few years ago, we started really seriously thinking about this question, how to have impact and inform decisions and make sure that our science matters. And we thought, hey, we're a science organisation. Let's science that question. So we did that. We explored the literature. We looked at our client surveys that we've been doing for years. We looked at a whole lot of case studies. And we came up with 4 key enablers that are kind of like the success factors for having our science matter and make a difference. And those things, they kind of seem like common sense, really. They're exactly what you might expect. The first one is the quality of our engagement and our relationships. The second one is the credibility and reputation of our science and our scientists. You can trust what we're doing. The third one is that it's meaningful for people, that we are delivering relevant, applicable knowledge that people can use. And the fourth one is that people know about it and can use it. Effective communication and dissemination of knowledge in a way that's useful for people. Sometimes we call that visibility. So those are the 4 key things that we've identified are super important in actually making that difference in how our science gets translated into decision making. And that means that those things apply to both our science and our scientists. So in terms of that, giving frank and fearless advice, which is a phrase you often hear about the role of public servants, and that our advice is robust and trusted, I know Richie mentioned earlier that scientific publications are not the be all and end all, but they are a tool to help us demonstrate that our work is robust and trusted. So this paper, for example, by 3 of our staff has been cited about 1,200 times. That number might be out of date, might be way more by now, but that sort of recognition and impact of a science publication demonstrates that you can trust what these guys are saying about this kind of work. And then we also do, share our work in ways that meets audiences where they are. So making sure that the information where we're making that really direct exchange is relevant, accessible, engaging, clear, and makes sense to them. So we kind of break this up into a couple of different pathways, if you like. One of the pathways that we can achieve impact is through stuff, products, publications, things, places where people can find that information. And then the other one is a whole range of processes which are around those relationships. They're around communication and engagement. In the middle is that providing information direct to high-level decision makers, like reports, presentations, briefings, those sorts of things. But we rarely get that opportunity in the middle. It's usually in the communications, the publications, and in the processes at the bottom where we get most opportunity. And this is a communication series, so I'm reckoning that all of you are probably way aware that if you want to get a message across, you have to do it in 7 different ways, right? So one way will not work. There has to be lots of different products, communications, meetings, seminars, lots of different ways to meet people in different ways that they're listening and that we're listening to them as well. So, my first slide here had a nice, neat line of science to policy, but I think it's probably already evident that it doesn't really work like that. This is a more meandering path with a bit of messiness and a whole lot of different things coming into this pathway from science to policy. And in fact, it doesn't even look like that. It looks more like this. There are multiple pathways all over the place. And there are also lots of other inputs coming in. Anyone making big decisions about the world, not just listening to the science. They're certainly listening to the values that Richie talked about. And there are all kinds of inputs or tributaries into these decision-making processes. There are economic considerations, social ones, political ones, legislative ones. What's possible? What can we do in the framework that we have? What are the cultural considerations? Historic, even habits. There's a whole lot of context around what actually makes decisions happen. So given this kind of landscape, it's super important for us to be quite strategic about where we join in this context. So we've got this framework that we use the handy acronym of GAMPA. And GAMPA is a thing that we apply to not just communication products, but all sorts of ways in which we're going to engage or even think about the work that we do. And it is an acronym in which the G stands for goal. Why do you need to share this stuff or engage with people? What is it that you're hoping to achieve at the outcome end? And then the audience. Who cares? Who has influence? Who needs and wants to know about this stuff? The message, what's the key thing? Distill it down. What's the key thing that you really want people to understand or that you want to understand from them? What kind of platform will work? Is it just a presentation? Is it a conversation? Is it a meeting? What is the thing or things probably that will help convey and help you have influence? And then always evaluating it. Did that work? Am I reaching my goal? What could I do differently next time? And then refining it differently. So this framework is one that we apply in so many different contexts at ARI, and we find it really helpful. I'm reckoning that most of you will have pretty clear in your head the why. What and remember to think why about outcome. An answer to why is not I want to be on Twitter. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about. The why is, what is the outcome that you want to see in the world? And there will be steps towards that. I'm guessing that you've got your goal sorted, but the audience is crucial. You know, people are so important in this stuff. There are the people who care, the people who have influence. Sure, there are ministers and advisors and key staff up the top there, but there are all kinds of other people who care about this and who will have influence in this kind of process. Some of them will be people that you might have a direct opportunity with or line of sight with, or they might have a direct influence on the decision, but many of them are more indirect. So instead of us just going straight to the decision makers, we're often working through the people who have influence more indirectly. And I notice that a lot of organisations now are actually investing in dedicated boundary spanners. We might have called these knowledge brokers or science diplomats in the past, but now this sort of term is being used quite a lot. So these are great people to know in an organisation that has them, or even be them. You know, these are really crucial processes and people to know about. And there's a great book about that if you want to know more about boundary spanners and how they can work. So I really want to reinforce this idea that people are crucial in this because it's people that make policy and make decisions. So it's crucial to get to know who those people are and invest in a genuine two-way relationship like Richie talked about. This is not just you telling people stuff. This is about a relationship in which people listen to each other and in which you think about how can my science be helpful to them, and providing that information to them in a way that they see that it's useful for them, and that you listen to how they respond to that and adjust or adapt so that you are more useful. And then keep track of it, you know, keep that relationship healthy. And it might sound a bit sort of simple or a bit weird to say, just be friendly. But honestly, you do not influence decision makers by yelling at them and telling them how stupid they are. Please be friendly, but have an actual, genuine human relationship with people and be trusted, and you're more likely to have influence. In our department a few years ago, excuse the acronym because we, of course, we're a government department. We used to have a different name back then. We thought we would actually do an analysis right across the department of how science policy collaborations work. We looked at a whole lot of case studies, we looked at the literature, we did a lot of questions with different people. And, you know, all these things come up with the same kinds of ideas. The same kinds of success factors come up again and again and again. Unsurprisingly, the top 10 tips that we identified in this process were things like invest in good two-way relationships. Be really careful and take great attention to clarity. Share things in meaningful ways, evaluate as you go, and, you know, adjust and adapt along the way. If we look at it from the other perspective, if you like, from a policymaker's perspective, you know, I've jotted down notes like Shannon was saying and listened to presentations and read things that a lot of ex-politicians have said about this. And I've gathered those things into another top 10 tip list. And again, there's no surprises in here. These are the things that ex-deputy premiers of Victoria have said. These are the things that ex-ministers have said, are the things that make sense to them about what informs their decision-making. So be targeted and strategic and focused about who you talk to and why. Don't just contact, you know, spread across a wide group of people with some random message. Be targeted and strategic. Connect with the relevant people and join those networks and get visibility in that. Understand what their perspective is. What do they need? What are they thinking about? Including in terms of timing. Why do they need it now? Use the language that makes sense to them. Be concise. Make great use of story, metaphor, Those things are powerful. Our brains are hardwired for story. Use story and use their language. Be allergic to jargon. Visuals are always really valuable, and picture tells 1,000 words. It's totally true, but it's got to be the right picture, not some random one that you like because it's pretty. It's got to be relevant and be a metaphor for the thing, or be actually telling them about the thing that you want to talk about. Number 7's a bit like the be friendly, be a person that they can trust and have those ongoing conversations and relationships with. Adapt your message to what you're hearing back. Keep in touch. This is a long-term relationship. Look for the opportunities to be helpful, be patient for when those opportunities might come, and manage your own expectations that just because you know someone and you've shared some information with them, you're not going to see it turn up in policy next week. This is long-term stuff, and lots of things inform policy. And be prepared for meetings. Someone in our organisation who had come from a university said to me once that they'd suddenly realised how government works. Like in a university, things progress by publication, but in government, things progress by meetings. Meetings, meetings, meetings. So don't dismiss meetings. They are an opportunity to build relationships and talk. So, there's a few different things I've talked about where we've actually analysed what works here. We've looked at it at a department perspective. We've looked at it at an ARI perspective. We've listened to what policymakers say. And many of you will know that there's loads of other literature on this. This is one that I particularly like because I think it's got a great graphic. This work by Megan Evans et al. On how you actually achieve policy impact. I really like this paper, and I encourage you to chase it up and have a good read of it. But that's it for me. Join in with our ARI family, subscribe to our things if you want to know more about what we do, including in this space, and get in touch if you want to talk about this anymore after this. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Fern. I also wrote lots down from you. I love the be allergic to jargon. That's a fantastic line as well that I think I will share often. I also love the let's science it, using that as a verb. Definitely going to be using that. So see, this is why I love these webinars, because I just love to listen and learn and soak it up from you all. I also appreciated you talking about how it's a messy and multiple path, typically trying to get where we're trying to go. And that's one thing that we've really wanted to be honest and transparent about in these webinars, where it'd be nice to say, even though you have had great 10 tips, 10 steps and things like that, it would be nice to say, okay, here's A, here's B, here's the direct route that we're going to get you there with these webinars. But all of our speakers, all of these topics so far have had the honesty of it's not that easy. And I think we all recognize that, but there are things that we can learn along those paths. And then sometimes it's good to recognize that there are multiple paths for a reason, because again, one size doesn't fit all. There are other considerations that we need to be thinking of. There are other people we need to be listening to. So I appreciated you having that mixture in there where you had some straightforward tips and then also showing that messy tributary. And I also particularly enjoyed the fact that you had the tips from the decision makers, because I think that's one thing, some folks were writing in the Padlet and Richie touched on too. So easy for us to show up and say, hey, listen to me. This is what I think you need. When in reality, we need to say, hey, let me listen to you for what you need. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's very awesome. All right. One more screen share to make you all suffer through with me. For our third presentation. Our third presentation today is from Professor Catherine Williams, who uses the pronoun she, her. Catherine is a professor of environmental psychology in the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She enjoys exploring how people feel, think, and act toward plants, animals, and the places we live in, and what this means for conservation and well-being. She explores this in the context of forests, bushfire, and the nature of our cities, which she will be diving into today. So I will pass it over to you, Catherine.
How are we doing here? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
and hear me? Oh, has it gone to full screen? There we go. That's better. All right. Hi, everyone. I want to acknowledge that I'm Wurundjeri country, and I also want to acknowledge my collaborators in the research I'll be talking about today, Rebecca Ford and Andrea Rawlach, also from the University of Melbourne. So I have kind of one thing to say, really, today, and that is, I think for really deep and action-oriented engagement and communication, that we have an opportunity to harness the benefits of social science methods. So that's my one thing to say. And actually, Fern's already said it better. Science it. I love that that phrase. I will, acknowledge that this is not the only way for effective engagement and communication, but it's a way that we've been exploring as a team recently and finding really useful and inspiring to us. So hopefully this slide will move along. Okay. I guess a lot of what we've explored today, and I'm sure you've been exploring through the seminar around effective communication, really comes down to some foundational issues of knowing your audience, understanding the context that you want to seek to influence, and often, bridging different worlds as a way of developing a shared understanding. And I guess I'm here to say that social science, which is a skill that many are in the audience, I imagine, have, it offers some real, I guess, almost superpowers for these needs. It offers systematic methods for really deep listening, detailed insights to lived experience and context, so that we can really know the world, or we can get a deeper appreciation of the world of the policymakers and how they make decisions, and how we can speak to and potentially influence that. And social research methods also offer directly impactful approaches to bridging worlds and supporting change. So I'll talk you through a few of those through this short presentation. But I guess, in a sense, I'm trying to flip the script a little bit. We often think about communicating our research. I want to spend some time reflecting on researching for the purposes of communication of our research, and doing that in ways that might be more integrated. Because I'll be talking about research in forest and fire management, I want to give you just a little bit of background to the context of that research. Happily, it shares a lot of overlap with the context that Fern has described. So it's the same big state agency that Fern talked about, but the section of that agency that was dealing with bushfire management in the state of Victoria. And the work that I'm talking about comes from a point in time of that part of the agency trying to reimagine some of their bushfire management planning processes. So as they were thinking about how to plan for bushfires, they were working in a world in which they were largely working as a single agency and thinking mainly about public land. They were making plans that were based on a single set of statewide objectives for what we should protect, that reflected mainly a trade-off between human life and ecological resilience. And they had a process of identifying assets and then assessing and trying to reduce risk to those assets. They were reaching towards a new kind of approach to bushfire management, one that was much more working across agencies, working across different land tenures. They were really working towards trying to have more community input to their decision-making, decisions that were informed by values that mattered to communities. And while they wanted to keep the strengths of their existing processes of identifying assets, assessing risk and reducing it, they were really open to new approaches. So that's the context of the decision-making in a broad sense, We were doing this research as part of a long-term research program that our university has with that agency. And they came to us and they asked us, well, what are the values of the public that are affected by bushfire and bushfire management? You know, what are the values that matter to communities that we should be thinking about in this context? And then a second part of the question, which really is what I'm reflecting on today, how can values be integrated into our work? So the agency came to us with some questions, really wanting to understand the context of the social science that they needed as input to their decision making, but also help with making that shift. So I want to talk you through just a few ways that we used social science skills to really understand the context, listen carefully to those decision makers, and so develop our research in ways that could speak more directly and effectively to their work. The first thing we did was use our social science to understand their world, the process, the context in which they were making decisions. We did that through a series of interviews and workshops where we were asking big open questions like just what are the steps involved in strategic bushfire management? And then specific questions to follow up on the kind of concepts that they used that we could see were related to values of the public. Often things like objectives and assets were in their terminology. We used document analysis to understand, where were the value-related concepts in their formal guidance documents, things like objectives and assets again, and participant observation of some decision-making activities, really to dig into what their process was. On the left, you'll see a couple of figures that we used in the publication from that work that was led by Rebecca Ford. And I guess the key points here is that those social science methods allowed us to get a really big picture and smaller picture understanding of what people were doing and give us a language to talk with policymakers in a critical and careful way about how they were managing values in their work, and so to point to where areas where it could be improved. Richie mentioned earlier the tendency to value things that we can measure. That's an example of one of the kind of practices that we could pull out and talk about with decision makers and start thinking about, well, how can we move towards measuring values that matter? A second way that we do on social science to try and communicate more effectively was a kind of interdisciplinary practice that involved bridging the knowledge, our knowledge as academics and the knowledge of practitioners around this issue of how we work with values in bushfire decision making. So that involved processes that you'll all be familiar with of reviewing the academic literature. And I think here it was, Richie talked earlier about knowing yourselves. This was a way of, within an interdisciplinary team, really knowing who we were and what we brought to this, but putting it in an equal way alongside our new understanding of the decision makers and their world and how they were making decisions. And we mapped those two things against each other, as you can see in that figure to the left. There was a process of sharing and refining that way of thinking. And then it was on the basis of that that we were actually able to go out and do our more traditional social science, to do interviews, surveys and document analysis with the public to understand their perspectives on values that matter in bushfire management. And then we started a process of jointly considering their application. The third little example is really leaning into social sciences offering some tools to more directly translate and apply our research. So on the left, you'll see an image which kind of captures some of the whole of this kind of program of work that began with developing a shared understanding of how values figure in bushfire planning, then through understanding what values of the public are relevant to bushfire planning, and then this third step of incorporating values in bushfire management. We used research strategies like action research and participant research to translate research insights for particular planning and community engagement applications. And we went a step further to really almost evaluate our own research to understand what did and didn't resonate from that research, so understanding its impact in the context that we were working. Some of the things we learned from that, we could see how important collaborative research was as a strategy for triggering change, that it was interrupting processes and actually generating change within that part of the agency. We saw something that we had to grapple with, and I guess it's part of that humbling process of realizing that our social research was not the only knowledge, and there was not just one way of understanding the knowledge we were generating from our research. And inevitably, when it's taken up and translated, it actually changes. And that was a really important learning for us. And the third thing was just learning about some of those conditions that support practice change within an agency. One was just an orientation that was creative in approach. So agencies being willing to experiment and take a risk in their decision making. So I'll finish with just a little bit of advice. And I guess I'm speaking to researchers here as social scientists and wanting to say to you, just be confident. I think, if you have social science skills, they offer us something that is not just about understanding communities, but about understanding decision-making itself. And we can harness those skills in ways that allow us to be more impactful in our communication. I've already made the point to be humble, expect your research findings to change, understand that that's normal and necessary. Don't insist on one interpretation of your findings. Be patient. It takes a lot of time to engage in these ways, and you're often waiting for the right window in policy moment in which to have influence. And also to be open and courageous. Examine yourself, examine the effect of your research, and learn from what does and doesn't cut through. To those of you who are practitioners in this space, I want to encourage you to be open and courageous. I felt like this agency, DELP at the time, Deakin now, was brave in and has been brave very, very often in opening itself up to social science, looking at its practices. I think they have gained enormously from what that has offered them in terms of opportunities for their own learning. You need to be patient. Good social research takes a lot of time. You need to be ready to work. I think there's been a tendency in sometimes in places to think that knowledge translation is something that researchers do. That researchers have to tell practitioners what the knowledge means for their work. I don't think that's how it works at all. I think it's a joint deliberation. And finally, be creative. We've seen some fantastic creative practices amongst practitioners that we've seen as really generating great translation and application. I love the idea of research rumbles, which one of our collaborators developed as a way of really getting practitioners in and researchers in the same room to tussle in a rough way around research findings and what they mean. So I'll wrap that up there. Right, stop share if I can. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kath. I love that term, research rumbles. And I think it speaks to such a good thing that people often try to avoid conflict or disagreement when in fact we typically need it. We need to challenge each other's ideas and kind of widen that scope. So I like that framing. That was cool. I also really loved and I wrote it in the Padlet, inevitably when our research is taken up, it changes. That's so true. I mean, that's part of the scary part, right? Is we need to make sure we're communicating it well, because it can be interpreted very differently when we're not in the room and when someone else is talking about our research, but that definitely is part of the process. And I also liked you talking about how social science has multiple uses along the path. First, it can be used to develop a study and to dive into some things and to better understand the public and partners, but then it can also be used to translate our message and to better understand the policy and decision makers, so we are effectively communicating. So you touched on many facets of social science application. So I appreciated that. Thank you. And thank you all for your time and energy and attention today. Thank you again to our presenters, Richie, Fern, and Kath, for sharing their experiences and wonderful words of wisdom. So far, we heard from Richie about the importance of identifying our audience, not assuming who they are, and the importance of listening to, not just hearing what they say. Then we heard from Fern, who acknowledged the messy multiple paths that we need to take for communicating effectively with policymakers and the importance of understanding what they need. And then we just heard again from Kath talking a bit more about some grounded examples of bushfire management and how we need to understand decision makers in their world and how we can use social science to refine our way of thinking through this interdisciplinary work. So far, it's been a pretty quiet chat. We have had some questions being sent Richie's way, which he has been thoroughly and effectively answering, I believe. We did have one a question in the Padlet that I'm going to pose now. I think it was directed toward Fern. Let me find that question real quick, and then we can open up to a few more with our remaining time. So the question that I found in the Padlet was, in Fern's talk, are we talking about boundary spanners by relation, such as bridging social capital, or by expertise, such as general environmental scientists versus super experts in particular domains, or both?
I'll start, Shannon, but I'm sure there are others who will have inputs in answering to this question. The way in which it's presented in the way a lot of people have been writing about and practicing it is that it is both, a bit like science, it is both a person and a verb. So a boundary spanner is a person who understands the perspectives of people who are producing science and people who are interested in receiving the science, and they are a bridge between the two. And they are a bridge with content, with relationship, with networking, a whole lot of different things. And then there is boundary spanning as a process, which is, finding those bridges and making those bridges work in effective ways. So that's at a super high level, the context in which I understand the way people are talking about this. It had, the sort of knowledge broking idea has been used in the past to describe a boundary spanner, but this is wider than that, because a knowledge broker in the past has just been someone who's shared information, like found it and shared it in useful ways. The boundary spanner is more embedded in both worlds and is a more solid bridge that reaches really deeply into each side of that river, to continue the metaphor. So they're not just, sharing it around in a useful way. They understand more about the perspectives, and they, a few of us talked about timing. They're alert to the timings. They look for the timings. They share that information in the right way at the right time. So they're alert to a whole lot of other things just than effective visibility. But others might have responses to that as well. It's a bit like the science diplomacy idea. And does it answer
any follow-up?
Does it answer the question for whoever posed it?
It was anonymous, so I don't know. Hopefully.
Can I add something? One of the things that I think the Australian colonial experience reminds us of, in the front, what gets called the frontier, we had boundary riders who went out and checked fences and made sure animals were kept in or out and people were kept in or out. And I think there's a really interesting contrast between boundary spanners and boundary riders, and that science is full of boundary riders, people who think their discipline matters so much and their knowledge matters so much. And I think just stepping outside that sort of academic boundary riding that dominates so much and gets in the way of listening and collaborating, and people go and look at the bibliography of papers to see who's mentioned before they look at the substance of what's being said. That sort of boundary riding is anathema to that sort of boundary spanning that Fern's talking about is so important to building communities of communication rather than islands of self-indulgence.
And I'll just add a tiny point too, that another term I've seen used for that role is intermediary. And I think it's a term that tried to reach to similar to some of the ways that Fern described a boundary spanner. But one of the key terms that was used to describe it is strategic. So an intermediary, or I think probably a boundary spanner, are thinking strategically about what is the collective goal. And so what are the relationships that we need to then strategically build, support? What is the kind of knowledge we need to share and generate collectively to achieve that?
Kath, can I ask a provocative little question about strategic boundary spanning, which is, in your view, what is the time frame for thinking strategically? When I work with communities, I'm often saying, yeah, we've got to think 70 years into the future, if not further, as part of the strategic framing that we need to think. You know, one of my colleagues, Gregory Kaheri, said, what sort of ancestor do you want to become? And how do we want our grandkids and great-grandkids to think about the work we've done? So I wonder what you think is the strategic time frame for that sort of thinking.
It's a good question. I kind of want to handball it to Fern, because she was a session on deep time thinking yesterday, so she's probably got many thoughts rounding in her head. But I think I'll just, point to the bigger issue there, that we have strategic planning timeframes that agencies will link to their work, and it's really important that we are that's part of the process. That's part of understanding the world and the decisions that are being made. Like, we need to understand that. But I also think as social scientists, as decision makers, we need to push the boundaries on that, and boundaries on the time, and encourage people to think longer term, because we are, particularly, I guess, when I reflect on the role of our research group in helping this state government agency to work with communities, the conversations we have are really about a longer term relationships with communities of all kinds, and being there for the long game. Anyways.